This is the only true definition of horror literature. It is the stuff you find on the horror shelf at Barnes & Noble. That's it. Or in the horror section of Amazon. If you find My Kitty Playdate on the horror shelf, that is a horror book. Even though the whole thing is about a kid playing with her kitty, and then they have Tootsie Roll Pops and her friends forever. It's a horror book. Because that's how it's being marketed. Horror as a genre is a marketing device. In the olden times, there were two things. There were things that were meant to teach you. There were treatises and what have you. And those could be either in poetry or prose. There were medical texts in poetry. And then there was the novel. And the novel just meant a new story. That's all it was. When Frankenstein came out, it didn't go, this is a horror story. It said, this is a novel. Okay? And the thing is, there weren't huge amounts of books. But then, soon there were huge amounts of books, and you start putting them in bookstores. And you go to this person who owns a bookstore and say, I want a book that will scare me. She goes, this title, this title, this title, and this title will all scare you. Thank you very much. They're still novels. She didn't go, I'll take you to the horror section. Because she knew where all the scary books were. The books that scared her. She read all the books in the store. Fast forward a little farther, and you've got mega chains with all of the books and the teenagers in charge because they never read a book. And Mr. Barnes and Miss Noble need to know that the idiot teenager can get customers what they want. So they say, we're going to put the scary books on the horror shelf. And horror becomes a genre. You know? Whatever element there is of horror, there's going to be in other places too. But yes, typically though, there are some things we see. Typically it's scary. What is the most important element of a good horror story? Suspense is incredibly important, but it isn't the most important thing for a horror story in particular. I think you came really close to nailing it. The most important thing for a horror story is a terrified reader. You know, so there's all these theories, but ultimately it comes down to this. In horror, to be good horror, you want a scared reader. You want a terrified reader. People understand horror when it's real. Good horror stories today are different than they were 1,500 years ago. It's good to study horror. It's good to study and read and enjoy Frankenstein and Dracula. And even The Man in the Iron Mask, if you ask me, is kind of a horror story if you really think about it. All these horror stories that there are, think about them and read them. Les Miserables, geez, that's a real horror story on some levels. But today horror stories are crafted differently. And horror stories today start with one, a killer idea. Pun intended. Okay. Does anyone know what a log line is?
Yeah.
What's a log line?
Isn't that like one sentence summation of your story?
Yeah. Okay, so it's a single sentence that tells the setup of the story. And this is how horror stories are sold and how they're implanted in most people today. It's a quick idea. If you start out and you're like, my horror story, fade in the Gothic castle. A woman walks in. She's wearing a sheer negligee. Why? Because I'm a man. You know, and 7 minutes later you go, Act 2. This is not a good horror story for today. Okay? I have a horror story called Strangers. Family wakes up in the morning. They wake up late, so they run down to the front door because they're late. They try to get out, the door won't open. They run to the back door, it won't open. They run to the side door, it won't open. They open up the blinds, and someone has put sheet metal over every one of their windows because there's a serial killer who wants some alone time with them. Boom. That's the hook. First of all, your killer ideas are always going to be, always, about a guy who. Okay? You have to think about it from the perspective of this story. Remember when I started with Strangers, I said, it's about this family. That's my guy who. You're always going to have somebody who is invested in the story. Because when I say it's about a family who, do you know what I'm really saying? It's about you. It's about you. Guess what? And in fact, for strangers, when I wrote the cover material, I even said, you wake up in the morning, you're running late. And so hopefully by the time the person's done reading, they're like, I cannot buy it. I'm trapped. Second thing, your ideas are going to come from what scares you. So if you're going to send out your baggage into the world, you have to change it so it's not therapy. It can be cathartic for you. It really can. But you have to add something. Okay? So it has to start with what scares you. But you have to add something to it. You have to broaden it out. You have to make sure that what scares you, you dig down and you find the kernel of a universal fear. And that's what you're going to write about. You just send unfiltered the things that scare you. That's also what you're doing. You're asking people to look at what's important to you. A total stranger. Look, it's important to me. And they're going to say, who cares? And they're going to say that by not buying your book. And then telling everybody else, avoid the weird guy in the corner with the baby pictures. Don't buy his book. Which is the exact opposite of what you want to achieve. So look at what scares you, because the fears we have, all of them are universal at their core. They're about loss of something. You have to drill down beyond the outside, like the frilly little bits of the cake, and find out what the doughy best parts are. And talk about that. Okay? Killer ideas are about making things worse. So I wrote, what's a scary place? A prison. Prisons are scary. Has anyone in here been to like a real hardcore serious prison? They are scary. They are unpleasant places and they're designed to be that way. So prison, how can I make it scarier? Prison for the criminally insane. How can I make it scarier? Prison for the criminally insane, and there's no lights. Why? Because there is a snowstorm outside so severe, there's no communications with the outside world. Now I've got a good place for a story. Put down the black crayon and pick up the red one. So you take your ideas and you push them and push them and push them. Again, like the worst thing that can happen isn't death. It's not even survival. It's damnation. If you are a believing person, damnation is an actual physical, spiritual thing. If you're an unbelieving person, damnation is a loss of self. It's insanity. Terror and laughter are the two hardest things to get people to wrench out of themselves artificially. Laughter is the socially acceptable alternative to screaming. A guy falling down a hill. We shoot it far away, and in the bright lights we see him rolling down. And we go, idiot. Shoot it at night and up close, and we see the blood fly off his face and the pain, and now we're screaming. Horror will always occur in isolation. You can have groups and still be isolated. And so horror tends to disturb communities in order to isolate people. So you must find a way to isolate the characters. If there are a couple of characters in the story, they have to be isolated from each other. Thank you guys, you're awesome.